I've spent 30 years reading the language of mountains, the way light falls through ponderosa corridors, how elk move when storm pressure drops, the particular silence that settles over high country before snowfall. My grandfather taught me that language during childhood summers in these ranges, his calloused hands pointing out tracks and scat, his weathered voice naming peaks like old friends. He passed when I was 19, leaving me his rifle, his compass, and a restlessness I've carried ever since. Every autumn I return to the San Juan wilderness, climbing higher and deeper than most hunters dare, seeking something beyond the harvest, something I couldn't name, until that November when the seeking finally answered back. I tell myself I go for solitude, for the clean ache of altitude and effort, for that moment when civilization falls away and you remember what your body was designed for. But if I'm honest, and after what happened I have to be, I was searching for him, for some trace of the man who first showed me these ridges, hoping the mountains might whisper something I missed. The trail I chose that year followed a route he'd mentioned only once, in passing, during one of our last conversations. He'd grown quiet afterward, staring at his coffee with an expression I didn't recognize then, but understand now, the look of someone who's witnessed something that refuses. Translation into ordinary language. I parked where the forestry road dissolved into scrub oak and started climbing, 50 pounds on my back, breath crystallizing in the thin October air. The aspens had already dropped their gold, leaving the high basins austere and exposed, all grey stone and dark timber under skies that shifted between piercing blue and the colour of bruised silver. I made camp 3 ridges in, where a spring trickled from lichen-covered granite, and the view opened onto valleys that looked untouched since the last ice age. No human sounds, no contrails, just wind through spruce, and the distant bugle of a bull elk, claiming territory he'd defend with his life. That first night I sat by my fire watching constellations wheel overhead, feeling the particular loneliness that comes from being exactly where you want to be, doing exactly what you've always done, and realizing it's no longer enough. Something had shifted in me that season, a restlessness beneath the restlessness, an attention turning toward questions I'd spent decades avoiding. Why did my grandfather return here every year with such devotion it bordered on compulsion? What was he looking for in these remote basins where game was scarce and the climbing brutal? I'd inherited his maps, annotated in fading pencil with coordinates and cryptic notes that read more like poetry than navigation. One particular mark kept drawing my eye, a small X on a nameless drainage, with a single word beside it, threshold. I didn't know what it meant, but I'd triangulated my camp to put me within reach of that spot, telling myself it was curiosity, nothing more. The wind shifted that night, carrying strange currents of warmth and cold that made no meteorological sense, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I found myself watching the tree line with an intensity that had nothing to do with hunting. The mountains were listening. I could feel it the way you feel a presence in a dark room, not with your eyes or ears, but with some older sense we've trained ourselves to ignore. By morning, I'd convinced myself the feeling was altitude and isolation playing tricks. I've been alone in wilderness enough to know how the mind begins conversing with itself, projecting meaning onto random stimuli. I made coffee as dawn bled pink across the peaks, checked my rifle, and prepared for a day of glassing the high meadows where elk sometimes feed. Before storms, professional, methodical, focused on the familiar rhythms of the hunt, but when I stood and shouldered my pack, I caught myself looking not toward the elk country, but toward that unmarked drainage on my grandfather's map, toward the place he'd labeled threshold. My legs made the decision before my mind could object. I was walking toward it, following a pull I couldn't name, leaving behind the safe script of 30 years for something that waited in the old pines with the patience of stone. The air tasted different as I descended into that valley, sharper, electric, alive in a way that made my skin prickle with recognition and warning both. Whatever I'd been seeking was about to find me first. I spent the third day methodically working the ridgelines, glassing distant slopes for elk sign, moving through timber with the practiced silence my grandfather drilled into me until stillness became reflex. The valley he'd marked spread below me like a cupped hand, steep walls of spruce and fir enclosing meadows already bronzed by frost. I found a vantage point where weathered granite provided both cover and sightlines, settled into the cold stone, and waited as the afternoon burned down toward dusk. The light took on that particular alpine quality, crystalline and dense, turning every pine needle into individual relief against the darkening blue. I glassed the meadows in systematic sweeps, searching for the tawny flicker of movement that betrays an animal's presence. But the basin remained empty, too empty, as if something had cleared it of life. The temperature dropped with the sun, that sudden plunge that comes at altitude when the warming presence withdraws and the cold truth of elevation asserts itself. I was preparing to descend back to camp when the first light appeared in the valley below, moving silent and deliberate through the gathering darkness with an intention that stopped my breath in my chest. At first, I told myself aircraft, some drone or helicopter running a survey pattern, though no sound accompanied the movement, and we were miles from any flight corridor. The light was wrong, though, not the harsh white of LED or the warm glow of incandescent, but something that seemed to generate illumination without a visible source, a luminescence that didn't scatter or fade, but held its shape with geometric precision. I watched through my binoculars as it drifted laterally across the meadow, perhaps 8 feet above the ground, pulsing with a rhythm that felt organic, almost respiratory, expanding and contracting like something breathing light instead of air. Then a second appeared, and a third, moving in patterns that suggested coordination, even conversation, tracing paths through the darkness that my mind struggled to track because they seemed to operate outside normal rules of motion and inertia. They would glide smoothly, then stop with impossible abruptness, hovering without drift, executing 90-degree turns that defied momentum. My hands began shaking, not from cold, but from the fundamental wrongness of what I was witnessing, the way it violated every assumption my 30 years of mountain experience had built. These were not natural phenomena, not foxfire or St. Elmo's glow or any atmospheric effect I'd ever read about. They moved with purpose, with awareness, and as I watched them trace their silent patterns through the valley below, I felt something ancient stir in my nervous system, some recognition that bypassed thought entirely and went straight to the oldest part of my brain, where fear and reverence occupy the same sacred space. I don't know how long I watched, minutes or hours, time becoming as unreliable as the physics unfolding below me. The lights continued their dance, sometimes approaching each other until they nearly merged, other times spreading to opposite ends of the valley, as if surveying or searching. Occasionally, one would ascend vertically with dreamlike slowness, rising until it hung level with my position on the ridge, and I would press myself against the granite, heart hammering, possessed by the irrational certainty that it knew I was there, that this entire display was somehow for my benefit, or perhaps my evaluation. The temperature continued dropping, but I couldn't feel it anymore. My entire nervous system focused on tracking those impossible luminosities as they wove patterns that seemed almost linguistic, as if the movement itself was communication in a grammar I'd never learned. My grandfather's word echoed in my mind, threshold, and I understood with sudden clarity that I was watching the mechanism by which that boundary announced itself. The way mystery declares its presence to those who venture far enough beyond the mapped world. When the lights finally ascended together, rising in formation until they vanished among the stars, I remained frozen against the rock, my worldview cracking like ice under spring sun, every certainty I'd carried into these mountains now subject to revision. The walk back to camp happened in a fugue state, my legs moving on autopilot while my mind struggled to process what I'd witnessed. I kept stopping to look back, half expecting the lights to reappear, half terrified they would. The forest felt different now, charged with potential, every shadow pregnant with presence. When I finally reached my tent, I didn't start a fire, didn't cook, just sat in darkness with my grandfather's compass in my hands, its needle spinning lazily as if confused about which direction meant north. Anymore. I thought about all his trips to this place, the devotion that had seemed like simple love of wilderness, but now revealed itself as something else entirely. A vigil, perhaps, or a form of communion with intelligence that chose these remote places to manifest away from human noise and certainty. Sleep seemed impossible, but exhaustion eventually pulled me under into dreams of lights moving through my bloodstream like luminous fish, carrying messages my waking mind couldn't translate, but my cells somehow recognized. And when I woke before dawn with frost on my sleeping bag, I knew with absolute certainty that the lights were only the beginning, that something in that valley below was waiting for me to descend, to cross whatever threshold my grandfather had found decades before, and that I would go because the pull was no longer resistible. I descended into the valley at first light, moving through timber still locked in pre-dawn blue, my breath forming clouds that hung in the motionless air like questions without answers. The forest remained unnaturally silent, no whisper of wind through pine boughs, no distant crow call, not even the scold of squirrels defending territory. Just my boots crunching frost and my pulse thumping in my ears as I worked my way down the slope toward where the lights had danced their impossible geometry. The trees seemed to lean inward as I descended, creating a cathedral effect that made each step feel ceremonial, as if I was processing down an aisle towards something that had been waiting long before I was born. My grandfather's compass hung heavy in my pocket, and I found myself touching it repeatedly like a talisman, drawing comfort from its solid brass reality even as its needle continued that lazy, unreliable spin. The quality of light changed as I reached the valley floor, taking on a thickness I'd never experienced before, as if the air itself had become denser, more substantial, each particle weighted with attention. I pushed through a final stand of spruce and stopped so abruptly I nearly fell forward, because there before me lay something that shouldn't exist, a clearing of such perfect geometric precision that it looked carved by instruments into the wilderness, its boundaries sharp as surgical incisions against the wild tangle of forest that surrounded it. The circle measured perhaps 50 feet across, its perimeter defined with mathematical exactness, and within that boundary, the heavy frost that whitened everything else had completely vanished, leaving bare earth dark as turned soil despite the freezing temperature. But it was the patterns within the clearing that seized my breath and held it captive. Concentric rings spiraling inward toward a center point, interlaced with radiating lines that divided the circle into sections, and within those sections, symbols or glyphs that my eyes could register, but my mind couldn't quite hold. Shapes that seemed to shift when observed directly, but held steady in peripheral vision. I circled the perimeter slowly, afraid to enter, afraid not to, studying the way the frost lines stopped with knife-edge precision, not gradually melting but simply absent, as if heat or energy had been applied with perfect control. Steam rose from the bare earth in thin wisps, carrying a scent I couldn't identify. Not organic decay or mineral richness, but something else entirely, sharp and clean and somehow electric, like the air after lightning strikes. Close. The patterns had been created recently, possibly during the night, possibly while the lights were performing their silent dance overhead. And as I crouched at the boundary trying to understand what I was seeing, I noticed my hands were trembling, not with cold, but with recognition that I'd crossed into territory where normal rules no longer applied. This wasn't crop circle mythology or hoax. This was something imprinted directly onto the land with technology or consciousness so far beyond human capability that attempting to categorize it felt like an insult to its complexity. I finally stepped across the threshold, my boot breaking the perfect perimeter, and the moment my weight settled onto that bare earth, everything changed in ways both subtle and profound. The air began to hum, not audibly but subsonically, a vibration I felt first in my chest cavity before it spread through my entire skeletal structure, resonating in my bones like I'd become a tuning fork struck by invisible hands. My vision sharpened impossibly. Every detail of the forest surrounding the clearing suddenly hyperreal. Individual lichen patterns on distant bark, the crystalline structure of frost on pine needles, the almost imperceptible sway of branches in air that still felt motionless against my skin. The symbols at my feet seemed to pulse with their own luminescence now, faint but definite, as if my presence had activated something dormant, and when I knelt to touch one with my bare hand, the vibration intensified until I could feel it in my teeth, in my skull, in the fluid of my inner ear, affecting my balance. Information flooded through that contact, not in words or images, but in pure knowing that this place was a marker, a declaration of presence, a message left by intelligence that moved between worlds or dimensions the way I moved between valleys. That the geometry wasn't decoration, but language, mathematics as communication, patterns that described realities my limited human consciousness could sense but never fully comprehend. That I was being measured in this moment, evaluated for worthiness or readiness by criteria I couldn't begin to understand, and that my grandfather had stood in this exact spot decades before, his hand pressed to these same symbols, his nervous system flooded with this same overwhelming recognition. I don't know how long I remained kneeling there, palm flat against earth that thrummed with purposeful energy, tears streaming down my face from emotion I couldn't name. Not fear exactly, not joy, but something vast and terrible and sacred that my vocabulary had no container for. The sun climbed higher, but the clearing remained in shadow, as if light itself was being bent around this space, and I understood with cellular certainty that I was experiencing contact, that the lights from last night had been prelude to this moment of direct communication through medium and method that bypassed language entirely. When I finally pulled my hand away, the symbols had faded back to invisibility, and the humming subsided to background frequency, but I could still feel it in my bones, a permanent alteration to how my body resonated with reality. I stood on shaking legs, turned slowly to survey the clearing one final time, and that's when I saw them. Boot prints in the frost, just outside the circle's perimeter, leading away into the forest. Old prints partially filled with ice but still visible, my grandfather's. Distinctive lug-sole pattern, the same boots I'd seen in photographs from his final hunting trips. He'd been here, stood outside this same circle, and the realization hit me like physical force that this wasn't random encounter, but inheritance. That whatever intelligence had created this geometric scripture on wilderness ground had been calling to my family across generations, patient as mountains waiting for bloodlines to produce individuals capable of witnessing without breaking, of remembering without speaking, of carrying mystery forward through time like a torch passed hand to hand through darkness that had no end. I left the clearing with my grandfather's phantom footprints burned into my vision, following an elk trail that wound through dense timber toward higher ground where the ancient bulls liked to bed during midday. The rhythm of tracking usually brought me peace, reading sign, interpreting the story written in bent grass and bark rubs, becoming part of the patient dance between hunter and hunted that had played out in these mountains for 10,000 years. But within an hour of leaving that geometric circle, I realized the dynamic had shifted in ways that made my skin prickle and my breathing shallow. I was tracking a mature bull, his prints deep and splayed in the soft earth, his scrapes fresh on aspen trunks, but I was no longer alone in the pursuit. Something else moved through the forest parallel to my path, staying just beyond visual range, but making its presence known through disturbances that defied natural explanation. Branches cracked at heights no deer or elk could reach. Heavy breaks that sounded deliberate rather than accidental. Shadows shifted in my peripheral vision with movements, too fluid and purposeful to be tricks of light through swaying canopy. And most unsettling of all, the forest's silence had deepened into something that felt like held breath, as if the entire wilderness ecosystem was watching this strange procession of hunter being hunted, witness to something that happened rarely enough to command absolute attention from every living thing with awareness to perceive it. I stopped in a small meadow where the elk had paused to feed, his tracks circling a patch of exposed grass, and that's when I felt it clearly for the first time. Not threat exactly, but focused attention so intense it was almost physical, like standing under stage lights or being examined through a microscope. The presence announced itself through sensation rather than sight, a pressure against my consciousness that made me turn slowly toward the tree line on the meadow's eastern edge. Nothing visible at first, just dense shadow beneath ancient spruce, whose branches hung low and dark. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to perceive distortions in that darkness. Places where the light bent wrong, or the air seemed to shimmer with heat, despite the freezing temperature. I should have been terrified, should have chambered around and backed away toward camp, but instead I felt an inexplicable pull, a recognition that whatever was observing me from those shadows meant me no harm in any conventional sense. The elk I'd been tracking emerged from the opposite tree line, a magnificent six-point bull who should have bolted at my scent, but instead stood absolutely still, staring not at me, but toward the same shadows that held my attention. We formed a strange trinity in that meadow, man, animal, and something else, and I understood that this was pattern, that the elk was also being shown something, included in whatever teaching or revelation was unfolding across these ancient hunting grounds where my grandfather had walked and something far older had waited. The bull stood for perhaps 3 minutes in that unnatural stillness before turning calmly and walking back into the forest, and I knew with absolute certainty I would not follow, that my hunt had ended the moment I'd stepped into that geometric clearing and become participant in a different kind of tracking entirely. I lowered my rifle and placed it against a fallen log, the gesture feeling significant, ritualistic, an offering of trust or surrender to whatever intelligence watched from the shadows. The pressure of attention intensified immediately, and I felt rather than heard a response, a wordless acknowledgement that vibrated through the same frequency I'd experienced in the clearing, resonating in my chest and bones. Images began to flicker through my mind, not my own memories, but something being transmitted or shared, visions of this same meadow across vast stretches of time. I saw it under glacial ice, under different configurations of stars, saw great herds of creatures, long extinct, moving across its expanse, saw hunters with stone-tipped spears standing exactly where I stood now, and most powerfully, saw my grandfather young and strong, standing in this precise spot with his rifle also set aside, his face tilted upward toward something in the trees that made his weathered features shine with tears and wonder. The being in the shadows was showing me continuity, demonstrating that this relationship between its kind and mine stretched back beyond recorded history, that certain humans in certain places at certain times were called to witness, and that my bloodline carried some marker or frequency that made us visible to intelligence that remained hidden from the vast majority of my species. The sun moved behind cloud cover, and the meadow darkened, and in that dimming light I finally saw it clearly. A figure, standing motionless at the tree line, tall and impossibly slender, its form seeming to exist in multiple states simultaneously, both solid and transparent, both present and somehow phased into adjacent reality. My eyes could barely register. It made no movement toward me, expressed no aggression or even curiosity in human terms, but radiated an awareness so profound and ancient that I felt myself shrinking before it, reduced to childlike insignificance in the presence of consciousness that had watched mountains rise and fall. We regarded each other across that meadow space, and I felt the last of my rational defenses crumbling, felt myself opening to the impossible truth that the wilderness I'd believed I knew contained layers and dimensions that science had never touched and mythology had only glimpsed. This being had tracked me not as predator tracks prey, but as teacher tracks student, had been present in the lights above my camp, had created the geometric message in the clearing, and now stood revealed in daylight. Shadow, to deliver whatever lesson or initiation my family line had been receiving across generations. My hands hung useless at my sides, my heart hammered against my ribs, and I waited in that meadow for whatever came next, knowing that nothing in my life would ever be the same, that I had crossed a threshold between worlds, and the man who eventually walked back down this mountain would carry mysteries that could never be fully spoken or completely understood. The figure remained motionless at the tree line for what might have been seconds or hours. Time had become elastic, unreliable, measured only by my thundering pulse and the slow burn of cold air in my lungs. As I stood, transfixed, the being's form began to shift with more definition, cycling through states of matter that shouldn't coexist. Crystalline and organic, metallic and vaporous, density fluctuating like breathing. Light moved through it or emanated from within it, a soft luminescence that cast no shadows on the surrounding trees, as if the photons themselves obeyed different physics in proximity to this entity. Its shape suggested humanoid structure, but stretched wrong. Proportions that hurt to perceive directly, limbs too long and jointed in too many places, a torso that tapered upward toward what might have been a head or might have been a sensory organ I had no reference to comprehend. But it was the eyes, or what my brain interpreted as eyes, that truly unmade me, dark apertures in that shifting face that held depth beyond physical space, windows into vast intelligence that regarded me with an attention so complete and penetrating I felt transparent, every thought and fear and hope laid bare before examination that was neither cruel nor kind, but simply absolute. I wanted to look away, needed to break that gaze before it consumed me entirely, but found myself locked in visual communion that bypassed my voluntary nervous system and spoke directly to something deeper, more primal, the ancient awareness that had kept my ancestors alive on African savannas by recognizing, when they stood before power that demanded absolute stillness and respect. Then it happened, the communication that wasn't sound or language, but direct transmission, consciousness interfacing with consciousness in ways that bypassed the crude machinery of word. My mind flooded with visions that arrived complete and instantaneous, downloaded packets of experience and memory that weren't mine, but became mine in the receiving. I saw these mountains as they had been during the last ice age, glaciers carving valleys, while small bands of humans huddled in caves, painted with symbols meant to invoke protection from forces they couldn't name, but knew watched from the high places. I saw those. Same peaks under different stars during epochs when my species didn't yet exist, when these beings moved freely across a wilder Earth, shepherding the planet's consciousness through transitions and catastrophes that would eventually produce creatures capable of this very exchange. And woven through the millennia, like a golden thread, I saw my bloodline. Dozens of faces I recognized from old photographs and faces older still that I knew only through genetic memory, each one standing in wilderness places, each one receiving this same terrible gift of knowing. The visions came faster, overwhelming my ability to process. My great-great-grandfather on a Civil War battlefield, stepping away from the carnage at dusk to encounter luminous forms among the dead that showed him the futility and necessity of human struggle. My grandmother as a child, lost in these same mountains for 3 days, kept safe by presences that left food and guided her steps, though she never saw them clearly. And my grandfather, young and vital in 1967, standing exactly where I stood now, tears streaming down his face as he understood that humanity's place in the cosmos was both more magnificent and more humbling than any religion or science had dared suggest. The emotional weight of these revelations drove me to my knees in the meadow's frozen grass, my body unable to support the consciousness expansion happening inside my skull. I wept without shame, great heaving sobs that weren't grief exactly, but the release of existential isolation I hadn't known I carried, the fundamental human loneliness of believing we're alone in the universe, or alone in possessing the spark of true awareness. The being was showing me that neither was true, that consciousness permeates creation in forms and frequencies we rarely perceive, that the mountains themselves hold memory and intention, that the wilderness isn't empty space between cities, but the beating heart of planetary intelligence that predates our species and will survive our extinction should we prove unworthy of our stewardship. I understood in that moment why the elk had stood so calmly, why the forest had fallen silent. They all knew what I was only now learning, that these mountains were watched over by guardians who existed in the spaces between matter and energy, who observed humanity's stumbling evolution with patience that spanned geological ages. The being wasn't alien in the way popular culture imagined. It wasn't from distant stars, but from here, from Earth's own depths and heights, from dimensions that interpenetrated our reality like fingers interlaced. And it was showing me that my family had been chosen across generations to serve as witnesses, bridges between human understanding and truths that couldn't be spoken in congressional hearings or peer-reviewed journals, but only transmitted soul to soul. The visions intensified, no longer showing me moments in isolation, but revealing the architecture of connection itself, the intricate web that bound my bloodline to this place across centuries of return and recognition. I saw my grandfather not just in that single encounter of 1967, but in dozens of visits to these mountains throughout his life, each journey a pilgrimage he never named as such, drawn by instinct he couldn't articulate to family who wouldn't understand. The being showed me how he'd struggled after his first contact, spending months in silence, distancing himself from my grandmother, who knew something had changed him, but couldn't penetrate the wall of incommunicable experience he'd built. I felt his isolation as my own, the terrible burden of knowing without being able to share, and understood why he'd never spoken of it directly, why he'd only left cryptic notes in journal margins and brought me to these peaks as a child, his hands on my small shoulders as he pointed toward ridgelines and said nothing but meant everything. The entity was teaching me that witnessing wasn't a single event, but a legacy, a responsibility passed through generations like genetic code, and that my presence here tonight wasn't accident, but appointment, the latest link in a chain of consciousness that stretched back to when my ancestors first learned to read meaning in smoke and shadow. Then the transmission shifted, showing me others beyond my family, a constellation of witnesses scattered across the globe and throughout history who'd been granted similar revelations in different forms. I saw a woman in the Australian outback receiving knowledge from beings the Aboriginal people had painted on rock walls for 40,000 years, her tears mixing with red earth as understanding flooded through her. I saw a monk in Tibetan mountains sitting in meditation when light descended and showed him that what his tradition called enlightenment wasn't metaphor, but literal expansion into frequencies of consciousness that connected all awakened minds across space and time. I saw a scientist in the Amazon, her rationalist worldview shattering as the forest itself spoke to her through luminous forms that demonstrated intelligence operating on scales her equations couldn't capture, teaching her that indigenous peoples who'd always known the jungle was alive and aware weren't primitive, but perceptive. The being was revealing that humanity's contact with higher consciousness wasn't rare but constant, filtered through cultural frameworks that tried to contain the uncontainable, and that every mystical tradition, every unexplained encounter, every moment of transcendence reported throughout human history pointed toward the same underlying truth. We are not the pinnacle of awareness, but children being gradually prepared for fuller participation in cosmic community. The emotional impact nearly tore me apart as I knelt in that frozen meadow, caught between terror at the dissolution of everything I'd believed about reality and ecstasy, at the magnificence of what was being revealed. The being showed me humanity's potential and our peril, timelines branching like infinite rivers, depending on whether we learned to listen to the consciousness embedded in the living world or continued our deaf rampage toward self-destruction. I saw futures where we evolved into true partnership with Earth's intelligence, developing technologies that worked with natural systems rather than against them, expanding into the cosmos as ambassadors of wisdom rather than conquerors spreading damage. And I saw darker timelines where our species failed the test, where the silence fell permanent, and these mountains stood empty of human footprints. The beings withdrawing their guardianship from creatures who'd proven incapable of transcending their own violence and greed. The choice wasn't mine alone, but belonged to the collective, yet I understood that witnesses served a purpose in tipping the balance, that each person who received this knowledge and carried it back into human community shifted probability toward awakening, planting seeds that might germinate in minds more influential or eloquent than my own. Finally, the being showed me why now. Why this acceleration of contact and revelation in an age of satellites and skepticism, when such experiences were more likely to be dismissed than deified? I saw that humanity stood at a threshold moment, that our technological development had reached a point where we could either destroy ourselves or break through to the next stage of consciousness evolution, and that the guardians who'd watched for millennia were intervening more directly because the window for our choice was closing. The message was urgent, without being frantic, carrying the weight of ancient patience, but also the recognition that even geological time contained crucial moments when intervention determined whether species survived or perished. My family's history of contact wasn't special privilege, but responsibility. Generations prepared so that I might stand here tonight, ready to receive and remember, capable of holding these truths without fracturing completely, strong enough to carry the knowledge back down from the mountain and find ways to share it that wouldn't be immediately dismissed as madness, but might instead plant questions in minds hungry for deeper meaning than modern materialism provided. The final layer of transmission hit me with physical force, driving me to my hands and knees in the frost-hardened grass as the being revealed the personal cost of what I was receiving, the specific sacrifice required of those chosen to witness and remember. I felt the weight of my grandfather's decades of isolation crash through me like an avalanche, understanding now why he'd grown distant in his later years, why family gatherings found him staring out windows toward mountain horizons, while conversations flowed around him like water past a stone. The entity showed me that carrying this knowledge would fundamentally alter my relationship with ordinary existence, that I could never again participate fully in the comfortable illusions that made daily life bearable for those who hadn't glimpsed the vast machinery of consciousness operating behind the thin veil of material reality. I saw my future unfold in branching possibilities, paths where I tried to speak these truths and watched, eyes glaze with polite concern, where friendships withered under the strain of unbridgeable experience, where the woman I loved looked at me with growing uncertainty as I struggled to inhabit the smaller self she'd known before tonight. The being wasn't threatening me but preparing me, showing with compassionate clarity that wisdom came with Loneliness, that expansion of consciousness, often meant contraction of ordinary human connection, and asking without words whether I was willing to pay that price, whether I possessed the strength my grandfather had demonstrated by walking this path alone. But then the transmission deepened again, revealing that the isolation wasn't inevitable, but rather a failure of nerve, a pattern that could be broken if I found courage my grandfather's generation had lacked. The being showed me that previous witnesses had remained silent, not because speech was impossible, but because they'd surrendered to fear, choosing the safety of secrets over the vulnerability of testimony, protecting themselves from ridicule at the cost of leaving others stranded in the dark without guidance or validation. I felt the entity's profound sadness at this pattern, its grief at watching century after century of contactees retreat into silence, allowing the dominant culture to dismiss genuine encounter as delusion or fabrication, while the evidence of guardian consciousness accumulated in whispers and margins and deathbed confessions that came too late to shift collective understanding. The being was offering me a different choice, showing me that my generation possessed tools previous witnesses had lacked, technologies of communication that could spread testimony faster and wider than ever before, reaching minds hungry for alternatives to the soul-crushing materialism that insisted consciousness was merely brain chemistry and mystery was merely ignorance awaiting scientific explanation. The pressure intensified until I thought my chest would crack open, the weight of responsibility pressing down as I understood that my encounter tonight wasn't just about personal enlightenment, but about service, that I was being asked to risk ridicule and rejection in order to add my voice to a growing chorus of witnesses who were finally, desperately, trying to wake humanity before our species sleepwalked off the cliff edge toward extinction. The being then revealed the most terrifying truth of all, showing me timelines collapsing toward critical juncture points with alarming speed, demonstrating that humanity's window for choosing consciousness evolution over self-destruction was measured not in centuries or generations, but in years, perhaps mere decades, before cascading environmental and social catastrophes pushed us past points of possible recovery. I saw the Guardian's intervention intensifying because time was running out, because they'd invested millennia in shepherding human development and wouldn't abandon us at the final moment, but also couldn't violate the fundamental law that conscious beings must choose their own evolution freely or remain forever stunted in enforced childhood. The urgency flooded through me like electric current, making my muscles spasm and my teeth clench as I absorbed the stakes involved, understanding that every witness who found courage to speak was desperately needed, that the critical mass required to shift collective consciousness hadn't yet been reached and might not be reached before the darkness fell. I saw my own insignificance in the vast sweep of cosmic time and simultaneously grasped that individual choices rippled outward in ways impossible to predict, that my grandfather's silence had been his tragedy and my speech could be my redemption, not of myself alone but of the family pattern, transforming our legacy from one of solitary burden to one of shared awakening that might help tip the species towards survival. The being's final message arrived not as vision, but as feeling, a wave of love so vast and unconditional, it shattered every remaining defense I'd constructed around my heart, dissolving the boundaries between self and other, until it couldn't distinguish between my tears and the ancient compassion flowing through me from an intelligence that had watched over humanity since we first stood upright and gazed at stars with wonder. The entity showed me that everything depended on witnesses finding courage to bridge the gap between experience and expression, that the future literally hung in balance, determined by whether people like me chose silence or speech, isolation or connection, fear or love, powerful enough to override the instinct for self-protection. I felt the weight of countless beings across dimensions and timelines, watching this moment, invested in humanity's choice because our fate would determine Something larger than ourselves would either open new possibilities in cosmic evolution or close doors that had taken eons to unlock. The pressure became unbearable as I knelt in that meadow with the luminous figure towering over me, my entire being vibrating with the impossible responsibility of carrying this knowledge back into a world that didn't want to believe, that would resist and ridicule and dismiss, yet desperately needed to hear from voices willing to testify that the universe was alive and aware and reaching toward us with infinite patience, but not infinite time. The being's form began to destabilize before my eyes, its luminous coherence breaking apart like fog. Surrendering to sunrise, and panic seized me with primal intensity as I realized the encounter was ending before I'd found words for the 1,000 questions burning through my consciousness. I lurched forward on trembling legs, reaching toward the dissolving figure with desperate hands, as though I could physically hold the mystery in place through sheer force of need. But my fingers passed through cascading particles of light that felt like warm static against my skin, each mote carrying a fragment of the overwhelming presence that had filled the meadow with significance beyond measure. The entity's essence was separating into individual sparks now, each point of luminescence drifting upward in defiance of gravity, rising like snowflakes filmed in reverse, and I watched them ascend into the darkening sky with a sense of loss so profound it felt like witnessing every goodbye I'd never properly said, every moment of grace I'd failed to honor, every chance at transcendence I'd let slip past unrecognized. My throat closed around a sound that was half sob and half prayer, some wordless protest against the sudden severing of connection, against being returned to the prison of singular consciousness after briefly touching the infinite. And I understood with crushing clarity why mystics throughout history had struggled to return to ordinary life after genuine encounter, why they'd wandered as hollow-eyed strangers through communities that could no longer hold them. The last coherent fragments of the being's presence pulled upward in a spiral pattern that reminded me of DNA helixes and galaxy arms and the mathematical signatures underlying all creation. And in those final seconds before complete dissolution, I felt the entity imprint something directly into my chest, a sensation like a brand made of frozen fire that didn't hurt but permanently marked me nonetheless. The imprint carried a wordless assurance that I hadn't been abandoned, that the connection we'd forged tonight was permanent despite the physical separation, that I could access the wisdom downloaded into my consciousness whenever I possessed courage to sit in stillness and remember fully what this night had taught. But the promise came wrapped in warning too, a clear transmission that the veil between worlds grew thinner for those who'd pierced it once, that I would likely encounter strange phenomena for the rest of my life as consequence of this opening, that I'd signed an invisible contract written in starlight and witnessed by mountains that had stood sentinel for millennia. The last visible particle of the being's form disappeared into the vault of emerging stars, winking out like a candle flame surrendering to wind, and the meadow plunged into darkness so complete and sudden that I staggered sideways, my dilated eyes unable to process the abrupt absence of that otherworldly illumination that had turned the clearing into a cathedral of impossible light just moments before. The silence that crashed down after the being's departure felt suffocating in its totality, a pressure of absence more oppressive than any presence could ever be. And I stood alone in blackness, with my heart hammering so violently I could hear blood rushing through my ears like distant rivers, carving canyons through stone. My legs gave out and I collapsed to my knees again, then forward onto my hands, gasping for breath as though I'd been held underwater and only now reached the surface. My body, shaking with adrenaline and emotion, and the sheer physiological shock of returning to baseline human consciousness after expansion that had stretched my awareness across dimensions my mind had no framework to process. Tears poured down my face in hot streams that turned cold in the mountain air, and I wept with the abandon of a child, all adult. Defenses stripped away by an encounter that had shattered every assumption I'd constructed about the nature of reality, about humanity's place in the cosmic hierarchy, about the thin veneer of understanding we called knowledge, while surrounded by oceans of mystery we'd convinced ourselves didn't exist. I pressed my forehead to the frozen ground and sobbed into the earth that suddenly felt as alive and aware as the being that had just dissolved into starlight. And somewhere in the depths of my grief and wonder, I felt the mountain itself acknowledge my transformation, felt the ancient consciousness of stone and soil and root systems recognize that another human had finally, briefly, remembered what we'd spent 10,000 years of civilization trying to forget. Time lost meaning as I knelt there in the absolute darkness, my internal landscape so thoroughly rearranged that I couldn't find my way back to the person I'd been just hours ago, couldn't locate the comfortable certainties that had armored me against mystery and wonder and the terrifying implications of a universe saturated with intelligence beyond human comprehension. When I finally raised my head and looked around the meadow, my eyes had adjusted enough to see by starlight alone, and the familiar constellations overhead seemed to pulse with new significance, each point of light now carrying the weight of possible worlds, possible watchers, possible intelligences measuring our species against standards we'd never imagined existed. My grandfather's face appeared in my mind with painful clarity, and I finally understood the expression I'd seen in old photographs from his later years, that look of someone perpetually standing at the border between worlds, belonging fully to neither, carrying knowledge that created unbridgeable distance from those who loved him but couldn't follow where he'd gone. The being had asked if I was willing to pay that price, and kneeling alone in that mountain darkness, with my entire reality restructured around a 5-minute encounter that conventional wisdom would dismiss as hallucination or delusion, I discovered that the question hadn't required an answer because the transaction was already complete, the cost already deducted from an account I hadn't known I possessed. I don't know how long I remained in that meadow, kneeling on frozen ground, with my mind spinning through impossible revelations and my body trembling from cold and shock in equal measure. But eventually some deep survival instinct pierced through the fog of overwhelm and commanded me to move, to return to camp, to take shelter before the mountain cold turned dangerous. I stumbled to my feet with the uncertain balance of someone recovering from serious illness, my legs weak and unresponsive as I oriented myself by starlight and began the trek back through darkened forest, moving by muscle memory along a path I could barely see, my headlamp forgotten or perhaps deliberately left off because I couldn't bear the intrusion of artificial light after what I'd witnessed. The walk back felt like crossing between worlds, each step a small severance from the sacred and a reluctant return to the mundane, and I caught myself glancing backward repeatedly as though the luminous figure might reappear at the tree line, might call me back to continue the communion that had ended too abruptly for my hungry spirit to accept. But the forest remained still and dark behind me, holding its mysteries close, and I understood that the door which had opened so unexpectedly had closed with equal finality, at least for tonight, at least in that form, leaving me to carry the weight of encounter back into ordinary consciousness where it would either destroy me or transform me into someone capable of bearing impossible knowledge. My camp materialized from the darkness like an island of human concern in an ocean of wilderness intelligence, and I collapsed onto my sleeping pad without bothering to remove my boots, suddenly exhausted beyond anything physical exertion had ever produced, drained by the sheer energetic demand of what I'd experienced. But sleep wouldn't come. Despite my body's desperate need for unconsciousness, my mind too electrically alive with cascading thoughts and the persistent sensation that the being's presence still lingered somehow in my chest, where I'd felt that final imprint of frozen fire, that parting gift or burden or blessing whose full meaning I couldn't yet comprehend. I lay staring at the tent ceiling with my grandfather's face hovering in my mind's eye, and suddenly I was seized by an overwhelming need to feel connected to him, to touch something he'd touched, to find some tangible link to the man who I now understood had walked this same razor edge between worlds and carried the same unbearable knowledge back into a life that could never again feel fully real. My hands fumbled in the darkness for my pack, searching with increasing urgency through pockets and compartments until my fingers closed around the worn leather journal I'd brought as a talisman, the hunting diary he'd kept for decades that I'd inherited after his death, but had only ever skimmed through with casual sentiment rather than genuine attention. I pulled it close to my chest, like a child clutching a security blanket, and in that moment of contact, I felt something shift. Some whisper of recognition that prickled across my skin like static electricity. And I knew with sudden certainty that this battered book held more than routine observations about weather patterns and elk movements. I switched on my headlamp with trembling hands, the sudden brightness painful after so long in darkness, and began paging through the journal with new eyes, looking now for what I'd missed before, searching for the thread I should have noticed, and there in the final pages I found an entry that made my breath catch in my throat. The date read October 1967, and the handwriting was shaky, irregular, nothing like his usual precise script, and the words seemed to pour across the page with desperate urgency. Saw something tonight that I'll never speak of because no one would believe, and those who might believe are the ones I'd least want knowing. But I have to record it somewhere, or I'll convince myself it was exhaustion or altitude or the flask I shouldn't have brought. My hands shook as I read his description of lights moving through the valley, of finding a circular clearing where frost had melted in geometric patterns, of an encounter with a being he called luminous and terrible and more beautiful than anything in churches. And the parallel to my own experience was so exact, it felt like reading my own thoughts written 5 decades earlier by hands that had shared my blood and apparently shared my destiny. He'd written about visions of the mountains across deep time, about feeling observed by intelligence woven into the wilderness itself, about the profound loneliness of carrying knowledge that separated him from everyone he loved, and his final entry contained a single line that I read 3 times before its full meaning settled into my bones. They return to those who are ready to remember, and God help us, we spend the rest of our lives trying to forget enough to keep living. I pressed the journal against my chest and wept again, but this time the tears carried a different quality, less shock and more recognition, a grief mixed with strange comfort at discovering I hadn't walked alone into that meadow, that my grandfather had stood in that same liminal space and survived it, had carried the weight back into ordinary life, and found some way to continue, to love his family and work his job and move through the world even while harboring mysteries that could never be shared. The being had shown me those moments across time when others had stood facing that presence, and I understood now that I'd seen my own grandfather in those visions without recognizing him, that the entity had been telling me our encounter wasn't random, but rather part of something generational, something that ran through certain bloodlines like a capacity for seeing what others couldn't, a burden and gift passed down through DNA and reinforced by connection to specific places where the veil grew thin. I wasn't crazy, and neither had he been, and somehow that confirmation mattered more than all the cosmic revelations combined, because it meant I could carry this forward without completely losing myself, could find a way to walk between worlds as he had done, could honor the mystery without being consumed by it. The mountains had chosen us both, had marked us across decades with the same impossible encounter, And in discovering his hidden testimony, I'd received the final transmission the luminous being had promised, the assurance that I wasn't abandoned to make sense of this alone, but rather welcomed into a lineage of witnesses who'd agreed to remember what humanity had decided to forget. I came down from the San Juan Mountains 3 days later than planned, moving slowly through autumn landscape that looked identical to what I'd hiked through on the way up, but felt fundamentally altered, as though the trees and stones had been rearranged at some quantum level my eyes couldn't detect, but my bones registered with absolute certainty. The drive home stretched across hours of highway that I barely registered, my truck moving on autopilot while my mind cycled endlessly through the encounter, through my grandfather's journal entries, through the impossible task of returning to a normal life while carrying knowledge that made normalcy feel like a costume I'd been wearing without, realizing it was a disguise. I kept expecting the revelation to fade, for rational explanations to assert themselves the way they're supposed to when you leave the thin air and isolation of high wilderness. But instead, the experience only grew more solid and undeniable with each passing mile, settling into my consciousness not as memory, but as permanent alteration, a before and after so definitive that I could feel the exact moment in my life when everything had changed. When I finally pulled into my driveway in the suburbs, where houses stood in neat rows and streetlights pushed back the darkness that humans have spent centuries trying to eliminate, I sat in my truck for 20 minutes, unable to bridge the gap between what I'd experienced and where I'd returned, feeling like an astronaut back from deep space, expected to simply resume caring about mortgages and lawn maintenance and all the concerns that organize ordinary existence. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life, harder than my divorce or my father's death or any of the conventional difficulties I'd weathered, because this struggle happened entirely internally, where no one could witness or help. A crisis of understanding that I had to navigate alone because sharing it would only invite the kind of concern that ends with medication and therapy designed to return you to consensus reality rather than help. You integrate what exists beyond its borders. I went to work and performed my job with mechanical competence, attended family dinners where I smiled and nodded while conversations about politics and sports washed over me like transmissions from a distant planet, lay awake night after night, reading and rereading my grandfather's journal entries, while wondering how he'd managed to live 40 more years carrying this weight without crumbling under the isolation. I found myself studying his life with new attention, looking for clues to his coping mechanisms, and I noticed things I'd never registered before. How he'd taken long, solitary walks every evening regardless of weather, how he'd maintained a workshop where he'd spend hours working with his hands on projects that never seemed to reach completion, how he'd had a quality of gentle distance even in moments of family intimacy, as though part of him remained forever elsewhere. He'd built a life around the mystery rather than trying to force the mystery into his life, had created rituals and practices that honored what he'd experienced without letting it completely consume him. And slowly, I began to understand that integration wasn't about reconciling the encounter with my previous understanding of reality, but rather about expanding my capacity to hold both the ordinary and the extraordinary simultaneously without requiring them to make rational sense together. I started returning to the mountains every few weeks, not to the same location, but to high, wild places where the air thinned and the presence of something older and larger than humanity became palpable in the silence between wind gusts. I never saw the luminous being again in physical form. Never. Experienced another encounter of that overwhelming intensity, but I didn't need to, because the connection had been established and now thrummed quietly beneath the surface of every moment I spent in wilderness, a subtle awareness that I was observed and accompanied by intelligence woven into the living world itself. I'd catch glimpses sometimes in peripheral vision, movements of light that might have been atmospheric phenomena or might have been something acknowledging my presence. And I learned to accept the ambiguity as part of the teaching, understanding that certainty was what humans craved, but mystery was what the mountains offered to those willing to receive it. My grandfather's journal became my constant companion, and I started adding my own entries to the blank pages at the back, creating a document that might someday guide another family member who experienced the same inexplicable summons, ensuring that the lineage of witnesses would continue and that no one who encountered the presence would face it without the comfort of knowing others had stood in that same impossible space and survived. I was building a bridge across generations, honoring what my grandfather had given me by preparing to pass it forward. And in that act of documentation I found purpose that had been missing from my life before the mountains chose to reveal what they'd been holding in. Patient silence. The truth I've come to accept, the understanding that allows me to function in ordinary reality while carrying extraordinary knowledge, is that we live in a world far stranger and more conscious than our civilization admits, that the wilderness harbors intelligence that has watched humanity since before we built our first fires, and will continue watching long after our cities crumble back to dust. My encounter wasn't an anomaly, but a glimpse behind the curtain that most people never see pulled back, a revelation that some mysteries don't want to remain hidden, but rather wait for witnesses capable of bearing their weight without breaking, and that my family's connection to that particular range of mountains represents a covenant established generations ago for reasons I may never fully comprehend. I don't know if I'll encounter the luminous being again, don't know if my children or their children will stand in that same clearing and receive the same transmission, but I know now that I'm part of something vastly larger than my individual life, a story that unfolds across centuries and involves forces that exist outside the narrow bandwidth of reality we've agreed to call normal. The mountains changed me, marked me, welcomed me into their deeper mystery, and I carry that blessing and burden forward into every ordinary day, walking between worlds with the same quiet determination my grandfather showed, forever altered by the knowledge that we are not alone, not abandoned, but rather held in the attention of ancient consciousness that remembers everything we've forgotten and waits patiently for those ready to remember. Have you ever felt watched by something you couldn't explain while alone in nature? Subscribe for more encounters with the mysteries that hide in plain sight.